Joan of Arc, The Maid of Orleans. The Maid series. By Chris Lowry. The Maid of Orleans. Nestled in a small valley between two rolling hills, a thick forest gave way to a wide clearing. Once, the meadow might have been filled with waves of flowers, swaying in an afternoon breeze, but now, squat wooden huts gathered in the center, like mushrooms growing wild. The waves of daisies had disappeared, replaced with meager fields with tiny plants struggling in the midday sun. The huts were ancient, worn and dirty, little more than shacks thrown together with windfall from the surrounding forests. People moved among the huts, looking as worn as their homes, and almost as dirty. Tired farmer peasants, covered in threadbare cloth stitched together to fashion clothing, trudged along dirt paths packed hard from years of use to their small fields. The village was quiet, an absence of the normal sounds associated with life. The people didn't talk, just moved about their routine with numb mindlessness. They were peasants and this life was the best they could ever hope for. Even the children were silent, staring with wide eyes after their fathers moving to the field, or watching their mothers cook porridge over small fires in front of the huts. Small boys and little girls did not play in the streets, nor around the edge of the forest, as if the whole village wished them still. As if they were hiding. Move. Move. Watch it. A shrill voice cracked the silence. A pretty young girl dressed in boy's clothes ran down the path between two thatched huts brandishing a carved wooden sword. The blade was polished to smooth perfection and the handle wrapped with strips of cloth. She carried it with practiced ease as she dodged around and among the bustling villagers. "Slow down." A surly-looking man with a sour face yelled at her. Joan ignored him. She was 15, long of limb with flushed cheeks and smooth skin. Some might have called her beautiful but for the mane of wild untamed hair that flailed about her head like a dandelion puff, auburn tresses streaked with sun-kissed streaks. She moved past the end of the village and leapt over a creek like some wild animal. Two boys broke between the huts giving chase. The smaller, Leon, spied her racing toward the meadow and nudged his brother in her direction. John grinned like a cat and ran after her, leaping over the narrow creek with the same grace and abandon his sister showed seconds before. They could almost be twins but for the 12 months between their birth. He lost sight of her in the meadow and stood in the tall grass, watching the patterns the blades made as they shivered in the wind. "You cannot hide from us, little maid. We will find you." Leon joined him. John motioned his brother to the left and he moved to the right. They began to beat down the grass with the wooden swords they carried in an attempt to flush the girl from the brush. Leon glanced over at his brother and caught his eye. The older boy gave him a wink and the younger smile nearly broke his cheeks. He pitched headfirst into the grass as Joan jumped up and swatted him with the flat of her wooden blade. "I have you, Leon." She could hear John racing across the ground behind her, feet pounding the earth and the swish of his legs through the grass. "But what of me?" She turned and their swords met with a loud clack. She parried his blow and the two of them fought across the meadow, each gaining and giving ground in equal measure. "You cannot win, maid. I am stronger, faster." He huffed. "Big words from a little man," she grinned. "But I know something you don't." "A secret, little brother? Please, share." His eyes betrayed him. They flicked over her shoulder and his eyebrows lifted as he suppressed a wicked grin. "Soon enough." Leon lunged from her side. Joan ducked under his sword and swatted him across the backside, sending him sprawling between his two older siblings. "Stay down, Leon. I have your heart. And I, yours." John pressed the attack. His blows fell faster, each clack sending Joan further across the meadow and toward the line of trees on the far side. Leon scrambled out of the grass and followed, calling after. "Go John, take her." Joan knocked aside attack after attack. "Surrender, brother." "Never." "Then I have you." "Never," he cried again. John redoubled his efforts. Joan danced to one side as he lunged, slipped up behind him and booted him to the ground. He fell on his face, sword skittering through the grass and rolled over. Joan slipped the tip of her blade against his throat. "I told you. I yield." Joan lifted up his chin with her blade, then took it away and offered him a hand up instead. He grabbed her wrist and jumped to his feet. "You may be stronger, but I am a better swordsman." Leon jumped up and down on the side cheering their battle. "That was magnificent. Where did you learn that?" The three of them collapsed in the shade and fell back upon the earth. They were bathed in sweat and breathing hard, but contentment lined their young faces. Father taught me. John pretended to pout. He didn't teach me. You were too busy following Gaston around. And you weren't? John rolled over and grabbed Leon in a giant bear hug. Oh, Gaston, my love, he smothered his younger brother with sloppy wet kisses. My sweet. Kiss me. Leon responded, moving his head side to side as he made smacking kissy sounds. Joan reached up to them and pushed their heads until their lips touched. Both boys backed off, spitting and grinning. She punched each of them in turn. You are jealous he doesn't want to spend all his time at boys' games. He is a better swordsman even than you, said John. No one is better than Joan. The young girl shook her head and patted the floating mane of hair down with an absent-minded hand. There are many better than me. But you are a girl, and no one expects it from you, Leon countered. He settled on one side of her and nestled against her shoulder. Joan wrapped an arm around him and pulled him close. John slithered onto the other side of her and nestled there. It is true. I didn't expect that jig you did. What use is it all? Next year, Gaston and I will marry and he will not cross swords with me. You could make him mad enough, offered Leon. John shoved her back in the grass. You drive us insane enough. She batted his hand away and sat back up. I'm not the one who wants to chase after the English. Your future husband may go with me. God and our king call to us, he said. Both of you would be killed. Who wants to answer that call? John tackled her again and they wrestled in the grass, the laughter of children filling the meadow. Leon stared at the shadows among the trees. Quiet. John sat up and noticed his gaze. He turned toward the forest and studied the darkness. What is it, brother? Listen? They all held their breath and listened. A faint sound drifted through the trunks, difficult to make out and impossible to determine the direction from the echo. A rhythmic thumping noise coalesced into hoof beats. A lot of them. Horses. 8 soldiers wearing crimson sashes across their chain mail broke from the cover of trees 100 meters from where they were. The lead horseman spied them in the grass and wheeled his mount toward them, the other soldiers following. English, John gasped. Joan shoved Leon toward the far side of the meadow and ran behind him. John held his ground for a moment and turned to run after. You wanted to fight the English? She called out to him. Not yet. Leon tripped over a rock and slid through the grass. Joan bent to help him up while John stood guard over them. The English raced closer. Go. I will hold them. Joan shoved Leon ahead of them. You can't by yourself, she shouted. Split up. The siblings broke apart and raced into the trees. Joan was in the middle, dodging around the trunks as she tried to put distance between her and the men who pursued her. She could hear them crashing through the underbrush and could not tell which was her brothers among the noise. Leon ran south of her, breaking into a small clearing where trees had fell during a storm. He leapt over one trunk, aimed his foot for a second fallen log, but slipped on the weathered back and crashed to the ground in a small cry of pain and surprise. The soldiers overtook him. Leon scrambled backwards on his hands and feet as 6 men surrounded him. Help! Joan heard him cry out and angled through the woods in his direction. She burst through the trees into the clearing and stopped short. The English soldiers had Leon's breeches stripped and him bent over a log. 2 held his arms while the 3 behind him prepared to have their way. Leon! She screamed and raised her wooden sword. Joan charged into them, knocking one aside with her blade and cracking another across his nose. It crunched and fountained blood into the green grass of the clearing. Joan sent a blow toward one of the soldiers holding Leon, and he dodged away pulling his own blade. But he let go of her younger brother and Joan jerked him from the grip of the other, shoving the boy behind her to protect him with her body. The captain of the soldiers slid his blade free from the sheath and leered at her. What is this? We may not have to settle for the boy. Let us go, she gasped. The English recovered and now surrounded her. The captain eased his feet side to circle her. And lose our prize? He said through rotten teeth. Leon, run. Joan lunged forward with the tip of her sword aimed at the captain's face. He batted her blade aside. Leon ran for the cover of the trees, but a soldier reached out and sent him sprawling to the ground. Not quite time for that, the captain loomed over Joan and wiggled his eyebrows. We have business to attend before you'll be going. John burst out of the woods waving his wooden sword as he charged the soldiers. The noise and surprise of the attack combined with his ferocity threw the squad into turmoil. John engaged the captain in a sword fight, but his wooden blade was no match for steel. It bought them time, and a hole in the circle to run through as her brother backed the men into one of the fallen trees. Run! Leon raced from the clearing, scampering through the shadows, but Joan could not abandon her brother. She lifted her weapon and fought against one of the men. The man with the broken nose grabbed her from behind and lifted her off the ground. She kicked at his shins and screamed, but he slammed her into the dirt. She watched as John almost bested the captain, almost disarmed him, but experience won out. The English sidestepped a blow and ran his sword through her brother's stomach. The boy's face froze, eyes wide as blood dribbled from his mouth. He fell to his knees, eyes on Joan, and pitched forward beside her. "No," she cried. The captain wiped his brow with the sleeve of his tunic. He was a feisty bastard. "I'll kill you." Joan struggled against the two men pinning her to the ground. The English captain flashed a cruel grin. He wiped sweat from his brow again and ran his sword across a part of John's tunic yet stained with blood. He strolled to Joan as she struggled in the grips of two soldiers, and ran a long dirty finger down her cheek and into the neck of her loose blouse. He traced the curve of her breast with his fingernail and trailed even further, stopping at her stomach. "If all you French fought like the boy, this wouldn't be such an easy war." She hissed and spit, fought and struggled, but it was no use. The two men beside her were easily twice her size, with thick strong hands used to manual labor. "No." The captain continued to rub her stomach as she tried to bounce away from him. "Riding and fighting makes a man work up an appetite. We'll have our fun with this one." He twirled his fingers into her hair and gripped it tight until she screamed as he forced her to the ground. He ripped her simple dress up. She bucked and fought harder, but his weight was too much. He grinned in her face. Joan leaned up and bit his chin between her teeth until blood ran out of the side of her mouth. The captain howled and bashed the side of her head with the hilt of his sword. "Be still." He growled and used his knees to force her legs apart. Joan still fought, but weaker now, her head in a daze. "No," she muttered. He pressed his face close to her cheek and fumbled with his breeches with one hand. His blood left a smear across the smooth white skin of her face. He arched back, holding a wrist in each of his fists, and gave a triumphant leer. Blood sprayed across his face and he looked up to see one of his men, now headless, take 2 steps and fall. The other soldiers screamed as someone attacked them. The captain glanced at the soldier's head as it watched him, mouth gaping and moving like a fish out of water. He rolled off of Joan and jerked his breeches up around his waist, foregoing the string that tied them as he fumbled for his sword. A giant walked among them. His armor didn't gleam, the sun didn't catch his visor or surround him in a silhouette of golden light. Instead it was battle-scarred, dinged and dented, grimy from mud and gore and blood. The sword that flashed in the sun was well cared for, though worn from use, much like the man. He growled like a bear and bashed his way around the soldiers, laying about with his blade and shield. "Fight! Fight, you roast beef!" He moved like liquid, ducking under slashes, feinting and spinning as he sliced and slid through the English patrol. Men fell screaming as they clutched ripped pieces of flesh and stumps where arms once were. "You are nothing. Nothing. You fight like women. Small children." The captain met a falling blow with the edge of his sword and tried to rally his men. "To me," he cried. "To me." The remaining soldiers of the patrol made one valiant effort to overwhelm the knight with sheer numbers, but it fell with their captain. His head bounced along the ground past Joan and came to rest against the other, both eyes staring in bewildered anguish, only one mouth moving now. The rest of the men were cut down as they ran. The knight chased after them, the echoes of screams sounding through the trees. Joan shifted her dress down and crawled through the bloody muck. She tried to gain her feet, but the blow to her head cast too many stars and she fell into the ground with a splat. The knight returned and noticed her legs working to crawl away as she gained no ground. He lifted the face of his visor and smiled down at her. "Were you going to fight them all, little maid?" He was unconventionally handsome in a roguish way, long hair framing a lean wolf-like face and piercing eyes. "Fight," Joan whispered as she faded in and out of consciousness. "I am the fox," the man said to her in a lucid moment. She nodded and passed out again. "You will live, I think." He lifted her in massive arms and held her in the crook of his arms. "You are strong and brave. If I had 10 men with half your courage." "Courage," she called out. "Courage indeed." Chapter 2. Joan's family lived in a simple hut on the edge of a village by the creek in a stone home he built with his own hands. When he decided to marry her mother, he toiled in the fields after his farm work was done to gather stones and make mortar out of mud. He painstakingly built one large outer wall, with a door and 2 windows for ventilation, and a second door that the villagers all said was too ostentatious. But he sealed it with skins and asked her mother for her hand. Soon enough she was with child, and her father gathered more stones and built a second room on the hut, a small space barely large enough for the handcrafted bed and straw mattress, and when the child had grown into a little boy, the father removed the skin and presented him with his own room. The father built a third room, this one slightly larger, but it remained empty as several children did not survive. But finally a boy lived, and then a girl, and another boy, and her father made a second small room for the boys and she moved into the first one he built, while he and his wife slept in a mattress in the corner of the main room. Joan lay on her parents' straw mattress as her mother bathed her face with a rag and cold water. She bolted up in bed and screamed. "No. No." Her mother cooed, as only mothers can, and used 2 calloused hands to push her back into the bedding. "John?" was all Joan asked. It was all she needed. Her mother laid her head on her daughter's shoulder, and for a few moments it was impossible to say whose tears fell where as they mixed upon the straw pillow. After a moment Joan wiped her nose with the back of her hand. "Leon?" The small boy stepped through the door and gave her a small grin. "I am here." He was followed by a handsome 20-year-old boy with flowing black hair and sky-blue eyes. Gaston was her beloved and fiancé, and in a year, they would wed and her father would teach him how to build a stone cottage of their own. Her father pushed past him, towing her oldest brother Jacques in his wake. The brash 18-year-old glared at her, glared at his father, and plopped in a simple wooden chair to continue to glare at anyone who would notice him. "Praise the Almighty, you are all right." Her father stood over the bed and examined her. "But how did I get here?" she asked. Leon settled on the foot of the bed and gushed. "It was incredible. The fox, he carried you." "The fox?" Everyone had heard of the king's best knight. The man was legend among the villagers, often riding through and leaving game he had killed or spoils from an English caravan he had plundered behind. He was strong, and brave and loyal to the throne as only the most devout men could be. "The woods are full of English." Gaston took her hand. "The fox went through them like a demon." "Gaston and I went for John," Jacques muttered from the chair. "You are lucky to be here. The fox saved your life." Her parents bowed their heads in silent prayer. "I remember his voice," she said. Her father patted her on the head, and then ran his hand across Leon's cheek. "He is a good man." "The king's best," the young boy smiled. Death was such a commonplace occurrence it was almost impossible to properly grieve a loved one when lost. Accidents on the farm, accidents on the hunt, simple disease, even just struggling to live created an approach to loss that was more pragmatic than anything. People were born, people died. Everyone died, just some sooner than others. No one knew this better than Bet, Joan's mother. At 35 she was old for her region. She had borne a child a year to the man at her table since she was 17, and of them, only 3 had lived past 10. The fact that she had survived childbearing so often was looked upon as a blessing from the heavens by her neighbors and fellow villagers. The portly priest had told her once during the blessing of Herbert, child number 3 who didn't live through a winter cold, that it was her gift from God and her duty to multiply. Bet did her duty to her husband and Maker, and each absence carved a hole in her heart until it was practically stone. She would miss John, she would mourn him, but there were crops to bring in, laundry to wash and food to prepare so that those who remained could live. "If only he had been faster, we could celebrate with John," she said. "You cannot blame him for God's will. He is such a great warrior. How could he not save one little boy? He is a great warrior, mother. You should have seen the clearing, bodies everywhere. He beat them all by himself. And he saved Joan. But he could not save John. You cannot ask for miracles, only accept them as they come. At least we have our maid." Gaston placed his hand upon her mother's shoulder. "Do not worry," he tried to comfort her. "I will get revenge for your son." Her mother twisted away from him and busied herself next to the fire. "No, Gaston," Joan struggled to sit up. "As will I." Jacques planted his shoulder next to Gaston and thrust his chin out. Leon and Mom began to protest, but the 2 young men shouted down their arguments and filled the small room with the noise of raised voices. Joan's father stepped between the 2 knots of family and friend and raised his hands. "Silence. The room grew still as their voices faded in his commanding presence. There will be no seekers of revenge, her father stated. But father, what is done, is done. Going to be killed yourself will do no good to the dead or the living. I will still go. If not for revenge, then for my king. Joan pushed herself out of bed and held a hand against the rough stone wall for balance. Gaston, she began to say. But her father interrupted. I cannot speak for you, Gaston, but I would want you to stay for Joan. Her fiancé turned his blue eyes on her. She could see the laugh lines in the corners from his dazzling smile, absent now for the situation did not warrant laughter, but they're all the same, a reminder of what was and what was to come. Joan, you must understand. No, Joan shook her head, locks of scrappy hair twisting. I will not understand. Have you seen battle? Have you watched as someone you know takes their last breath, some sliver of metal slicing them apart? Jacques stood behind Gaston lending him support. And what do you know of battle, maid? You were knocked out, carried here by the king's favorite knight. Joan shook her head and the movement was too much. She collapsed back on the bed and sagged. I saw John die. Mom wailed from the corner, a low soft moan of grief. Death may have been common and John was not the first child lost to her, but the pain that accompanied such a tragedy left an empty feeling inside her chest. She used a rag to scrub at the wooden plank table, wiping imaginary crumbs with harsh swift strokes. Her father slammed the flat of his hand against the table and made the dishes rattle. Enough. We will hear no more of this. Any of it. But still, Gaston interjected. I must go. And I too. Father, I am a man. I will go for God and my king, Jacques added. I cannot lose you too. Jacques reached a thin hand out and placed it on top of his mother's on the table. I must do my duty. Joan struggled to rise from the cot in the corner. Then I will go. Her statement brought silence from everyone. They stared at her as if she were speaking gibberish. What did you say? I said I will go too, she insisted. Gaston snorted. You're a woman. Joan stood and faltered as the room began to spin around her. She put one hand against the stone wall to steady herself and blinked away the stars. And a better swordsman than you. You would not need a sword. The English would drop dead from laughter, Jacques added. None of you will go, her father said with finality. He stood from the table and gave his seat to Joan, then walked to the door of the hut. His knees creaked and popped as it took a few steps to warm up. And there will be no more talk of it in this house. No one said anything as he left. He was the head of the house and his word was law. Joan's mother filled a cup with warm broth and placed it on the table in front of her. You are tired, maid. You need to rest, recover for today. Out, all of you. She herded her two sons toward the door to follow after their father. Gaston put a hand upon her shoulder and said in a soft voice. May I speak with her? Her mother glanced at Joan, who gave a quick nod. She sighed. For a moment. She watched him kneel beside her chair and excused herself through the front door to join the others. Gaston put his hands onto hers around the steaming mug. Joan, maid. She wouldn't look at him, couldn't make eye contact and show him the pain. She should have been stronger to protect John, should have fought better against the English. But she didn't. He had been her best friend growing up, her almost twin, and now he was gone forever. Rage bubbled beside the grief, each washing up and over her in waves so that she felt like crying and screaming and crying each in turn until there was nothing left inside her to hurt. And now Gaston, her fiancé, her promised, was going off to war and leave her behind. She wouldn't be able to protect him either. Joan sent up a silent prayer to God to do what she could not. But she did not ask for just protection, she prayed for guidance and the clarity to understand. Do not speak to me. She lifted the cup to her lips and sipped the warm broth, ignoring the man on his knees beside her. I cannot leave with you angry. Then you will not leave. But I must. She turned to him now, her emotions quelled by the broth and the possibilities. Joan grabbed his hand and placed the flat of his palm onto her heart. She heard his breath hitch in his chest, felt the sweat on his fingertips as they brushed against her skin. Must throw away both our lives on a whim. You know, I have thought of this, he gulped. He wasn't referring to his hand though, and she knew it. As we thought of many things. Of travel and wealth and fame. As we thought of knowing each other before marriage. Gaston, these were just thoughts, fancies to hold us until the right time, just thoughts, not actions. Now, I am acting, he bowed his head. It is something I must do. Why? Why must you? This will pass. This king will pass, this war will go. And we will still be here, living our lives. Don't you listen to me? I want to make a difference in this world. Our baby-faced king is my same age and he is a ruler. The fox is the greatest warrior to ever live. I cannot be just a farmer. You would be my husband. He took his hand away and let it fall between them. It's not enough. Joan sniffed. It didn't quite crack her stone-like exterior she practiced at keeping, but it was admission enough. Don't go, she said. Gaston stood and walked backward toward the door. I am sorry. I will follow you, she threatened. I will make you protect me. You would get us both killed. Stay here. Wait for me. He stopped when he bumped against the wooden doorway and blew her a kiss. I will leave in the morning. Please. She begged. I will come back after the war. I promise. She watched him walk through the door and close it after. The clattering of the latch cracked whatever resolve she had managed to hold to that point and she collapsed onto the table, tears streaming. For John. For Gaston. For the future loss that never could be. She knew that even if Gaston came back, he would never be the same boy she fell in love with. Because even her short battle with the English had changed her, had stripped away all of her childlike pretense and thoughts of a better world. It was not to be. The door opened and in seconds her mother was petting her head, the silence from the woman a comfort, sharing the burden of the loss with her daughter. They stayed like that for several moments more, and when the boys and her father returned, Joan was in her own room of the hut, facing the wall. Chapter 3. Joan slept deep, her dreams haunted by the visage of red-faced soldiers, spit-speckled lips yelling at her, taunting her, and she tried to run but couldn't escape. She was no longer in the meadow, but the street of the village proper, and they came at her in waves, grabbing for her, pawing with their black-tipped fingers and dirt-grimed hands. She batted them away with her wooden sword, but there were just so many of them, too many to fight, and she cried out. Someone shook her awake. Jacques put his hand over her mouth to keep her silent. Shh, he whispered, his lips close to her ear. Joan. She batted his hand away and sat up with her back to the wall, the thin hand-spun blanket a twisted knot in her hands where she had gripped it in her sleep. What are you doing? She gasped, eyes wide as she glared around the dark room. A single candle flickered on a shelf next to the window-sill, moving in a breeze that leaked through the pores around the closed shutters. It cast weak shadows on the wall that weaved and bobbed, and Joan realized that they were not English, could not be, for there was only her and her older brother in the room. She shook her head to rid herself of the last vestiges of the dream and watched him. I am saying goodbye, little maid, her brother was saying. Gaston and I are leaving to join the king. She reached out to grab his arm, her fingers clenched on the thick padded jacket he wore for long journeys. Father let you go? Her face was a tumble of confusion. He does not know, the boy answered. She shook her head and held his sleeve tighter. You cannot steal away in the night. Jacques worked his fingers under hers, removing them one at a time until he could pull himself free. He does not understand. But I had to tell you. I will protect Gaston. And who will look after you? God. Inspiration? A noble cause to put a man on the throne, but do you think God cares for these things? I told Gaston. He told me, Jacques said. The world may not care for him, but we do. So I will watch over him for you. Joan spread the blanket out across her lap and smoothed away the wrinkles to keep her hands busy so they wouldn't grab her brother by the lapel and wrestle him to the floor to try and knock some understanding through his obviously thick skull. This is a fool's errand. I am no fool. Then stay, both of you. No. We have to go. And now, before father wakes. Take care of yourself, maid. Look after mom. She watched him go to the shutter of her window and climb through. He pulled them closed after, and she was left in the flickering candlelight to wonder if it had been a dream or if her older brother had really abandoned the family to go fight for the boy king. Her eyes darted from the window to the door to her room, wondering if she should go tell, to wake her father so that he could chase the boys down and drag his own screaming back to the cottage. It would do no good, she thought, for Jacques would just go away again when the opportunity presented itself. Better to let her mother and father have one last night of rest before they woke to a new nightmare of another son lost and gone. Her eyelids drooped heavy and gritty, and she closed them once, twice before sleep claimed her again. Chapter 4. Joan knew she was dreaming by the color of the sky. The pink clouds might have fit in under any other sunset, but the blood-red mountains they hovered over were like nothing she had ever seen. She knew of mountains, giant hills that touched the top of the sky far to the south, but there were only plains where she grew up, rivers and farms and woods. Mountains were something men spoke of after they had traveled, and certainly they were not red with blood. She sat beside a stream in the meadow, the yellow grass waving as the English patrol slid up through the slender stalks and surrounded her. Fight! She could hear the fox in her head. She glanced down at the wooden sword in her hand. It was so thin, and plain no match for their steel. But the voice commanded her, and Joan leapt among the soldiers, spinning and dancing, lashing about with the blade. They screamed and fell. Ribbons of blood arced through the evening sky until the stream turned crimson. The baby-faced king wants to rule the world, Gaston's voice called to her. Joan slammed into the bullet-faced English captain and knocked his blade up. She ran him through and could smell the rotten fetid last breath escape his body. Who will look after you? She parried a blow aimed at her head and sliced open another soldier. 10 men with half your courage, the fox called. Who will look after you? She cried. God, Jacques said. God, John repeated. The noose of English soldiers tightened around her. She fought like a banshee, lips curled in a snarl until all that were left were the broken and bleeding bodies of men all around her. Joan fought to catch her breath, fought to bring her madness under control. Her eyes trailed over the smashed and battered bodies. Gaston and Jacques lay among them, twisted and shattered. Joan fell to her knees and wept. Oh God! Chapter 5. Joan bolted upright in bed and fell onto the floor. She glanced at the shuttered window in the darkness. They need me, she gasped. She rummaged through the pile of clothing on a chair and pulled on a pair of loose breeches and an oversized tunic. She belted it at the waist with a rope, making her mostly formless. Joan tucked her hair down the back of the shirt and made a satchel from the covering on her bed, tying it around one shoulder so that it too contributed to masking her form. She slipped through the doorway between her closet-sized room into the main living area. Embers glowed in the hearth, casting her shadow against the stone wall as she tiptoed across the hard-packed floor. Joan crept to the mantel and lifted her father's sword, sheath and all, and settled it across her back. She adjusted it so her right hand could reach it quickly and sneak through the front door into the darkness beyond. Chapter 6. The birds were the first sign of the sun rising. Their small forms fluttered in the branches of the trees above the path she was on, twitters and chirps filling the morning air. The sun shed light across the trees and lit her way. Now that it was up, she could move faster and alternated between a slow jog and a brisk walk, one hand on the sword to keep it from jangling and bouncing against her back. She watched over her shoulder to be sure no one followed, and listened as she moved, trying to pick up anything that stood out from the ordinary. The birds were her first alarm. She noticed after 4 or 5 steps that the chirping had disappeared, replaced with a new sound. A groan and a creak sounded through the forest. Joan stepped off the path and crept through the edge of the trees as she searched for the source of the noise. She peeked around the papery bark of a trunk and giggled. The main road, if it could be called such, was a bog of wagon wheel ruts and soft mud. A portly priest settled his back against the rear panel of a simple wooden wagon and shoved, but the mud-caked wheels wouldn't budge. It didn't help that the long-eared donkey at the front of the wagon wasn't moving. Lash them, sisters, the priest huffed. 2 nuns sitting on the driver's bench turned to the donkey. One lifted the reins and slapped its rear while the other cracked a lash across the other side of the rump. The donkey brayed and refused to budge. Hold, said the priest as he shoved off the back of the wagon and slid alongside to the bench. He reached under the nuns and pulled a wineskin out to shoot a long squirt of crimson liquid into his mouth. Drops dribbled down the side as he swallowed, and he wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of a massive paw-like hand. Joan stepped from the shadows and made a small motion with her own hand. "Hello, Father," she called. The priest glared at her for a moment, studying what looked like a small boy in front of him with a sword that was too big for his frame. "Hello, child." Joan smiled and took a step closer. "You are not having an easy time of it." The priest shifted his glare to the donkey's rump and sighed. "It would seem the Lord prefers us here for the moment." Joan took another step. "May I help?" The priest smiled and studied her. "Never one to refuse a hand. Farm girl? Have a strong back?" He made a gesture with his arm, inviting her to do her best. Joan twisted the small satchel made from a blanket around her waist and placed it carefully on the ground. She lay her father's sword across the blanket and pulled something out of the pack that she placed in her pocket. She grabbed brush and branches from the side of the road and lay it in front of wheels of the wagon. I am from a farm, but when this happens, we'd rather use our heads. We want to put this under the wheels. She demonstrated as she did it, tucking the dry grass and branches under the wooden wheels. The priest dropped the wineskin back behind the seat and bent to help her. Get down, sisters, he called. Help us. The nuns clambered off the wagon and gathered more material for them to work with while the priest stepped back to supervise. They've taken a vow of silence but good company all the same. When they were finished with the brush, Joan moved to the front of the donkey and stood just out of reach. She dug a carrot out of her pocket and held it out to the animal. 2 ears flicked forward as it sniffed the air and brayed, then took 2 steps forward until the harness pulled tight. The donkey strained against the stuck wheels for a moment until they caught on the brush. The wagon jolted forward as Joan backed away, chased by the donkey. A miracle, smiled the priest as he crossed himself. The nuns did the same. Not quite, Joan answered. A godsend then. Thank you, young girl. Where are you for? Joan scooped up her pack and sword and arranged them both upon her back. My cousin's home, she explained. The priest eyed her sword with curiosity. He had noticed that she was not a boy, but a girl dressed so as to give the impression of being one. It was a safe way to travel, as safe as could be upon this English-infested roads, but those dogs cared not for gender when intent upon their nefarious ways. A boy with a sword would present a tempting target with 2 treasures for them to pillage and plunder. Joan watched him watch her. She placed the palm of her hand on the tip of the sword and adjusted it. My father's. He wishes my cousin to have it to support the king. Ride with us then. At least for a way. Safer in our company than a young girl alone. Joan nodded. She was sure her disguise was better than that, but the bulky clothing didn't hide her true identity from the watchful eyes of the priest. That is why my cousin goes to fight, she said. To make it safe. She climbed up into the back of the narrow wagon and leaned against the wooden side so she could see the priest. He yanked and struggled his bulk into the seat next to the nuns who didn't move to help him, and settled red-faced and huffing as he reached for the reins. He blew out a mighty exhalation that made his puffy lips flutter with a sound that caused the donkey to bray loudly. One of the nuns covered her mouth to smother a giggle, the sound of which escaped in a light snort. Silent indeed, the priest huffed as he chucked the reins against the donkey's rump. Thank you. These are trying times. We are lucky to travel under the grace and protection of God. Few will molest us. You mean none, Joan corrected him. The portly priest sighed, the bulk of his shoulders heaving with the effort. If only. The countryside is littered with heathen who care nothing for God or king. I only know one man who goes where he will without fear. The king's fox. You know the fox? He traveled with us on more than one mission of mercy. A devout and trusted man. He saved me once. An English patrol ambushed my brothers and me at play. They killed my brother before the fox could reach us. The priest made the sign of the cross from his forehead to his heart and tapped on both shoulders. The sisters genuflected with him. I don't blame him. He saved me. The fox saves all. His faith in God gives him strength. He tells me of his visions. Visions? She scooted her back up against the splintered rough-hewn board on the side of the wagon in an effort to find a more comfortable position in the straw. Dreams. Insights into life. They haunt him. Joan nodded as she understood what he meant. I had a dream that haunted me. After the attack, I dreamed I alone was left standing in a battlefield, surrounded by men that I had beat. I was protected by God. The sisters genuflected again, eyes locked on the road ahead of them. The priest glanced over his shoulder to stare at her a moment. What? Asked Joan. It sounds like a vision. The fox relayed to me a similar dream. It would seem he has imported his invincibility to you. Me? A vision? I think not. Do not be surprised. Was Mary any less scared when she heard the voice of an angel? It was not meant for me, she sputtered. Perhaps. Perhaps not. Remember the story of Jonah. Do not try to avoid God's will or you might find yourself in the belly of a fish. Not if I avoid the sea. The priest burst out laughing and the nuns covered their mouths. The sound he made was joyful and full of mirth and Joan found it contagious. She smiled back at him. Am I pushing a vision on you? I may. In these times, a man of God searches for any and every sign of his divine intervention. I do not mean to assume his mantle. I am not afraid. I am, the priest said, and his smile evaporated. We are for the siege of Orleans. Orleans? Even we have had news of them. It would seem one bold stroke could end it all, yet the siege drags on. Why doesn't the king send the fox? She asked. If he was the king's best knight and as powerful a warrior as her brother and fiancé had said, he could rally the men and deliver that one bold stroke. So not all news travels to the provinces. Our young king is in danger of assassination. He needs the knight for bodyguard. Then how could he rescue me? Joan wondered. What do I know of kings and war? He travels the countryside when away from Avignon. He searches for meaning? Or for something he lost? What has he lost? She asked. The priest's cheek grew scarlet and he concentrated for a moment on the reins in his hands. He spared a glance for the two nuns who studiously kept their eyes on the road. I am only guessing, he said after a moment. I learn little from my conversations with him. The sisters, on the other hand. He tells them all. He motioned with his hands, but they didn't react. They know everything, but cannot tell. After that he sat in silence contemplation, as quiet as the nuns with their vows, and Joan leaned back against the boards and rocked in the wagon bed, swaying back and forth on the well-worn rutted path. The sun on her face felt warm, and she closed her eyes to listen to the wind and pray for the safety of those two men she sought, and for the family she left behind. In moments her head nodded forward as she fell asleep. Chapter 7. She woke when the wagon stopped. The sun was high but beginning its westward journey as she stirred in the straw and lifted her head over the side of the boards. They were at a crossroads in the woods, another muddy rutted path intersecting the one they were on. She slid over the side of the wagon and landed on her feet with grace. The priest rooted around in a burlap sack at his feet and passed her a smaller canvas bag with fruit and bread inside. Take this, child. Joan pawed the sleep from her eyes and stretched. Thank you, Father, but my cousin is only up the road a half day. Then he will enjoy it with you. She accepted the bag and secreted it among her own. I have enjoyed your company. Go with God, little one. One of the nuns flicked the reins across the rump of the donkey and they continued down the road. Joan watched them go until they were almost out of sight, then began walking along the side of the road they had crossed. Chapter 8. Joan trudged up the road to a small hut on the edge of green pasture land. Cows munching grass stopped and watched her with large moist eyes as she approached the wooden slab door and pounded on it with her fist. A tall thin-faced man with a wispy mustache threw the door open, his face red in preparation to yell, but he let out his breath in one big whoosh as it broke into a smile. He wrapped Joan in a one-armed hug, and his thick wife Michelle rushed her from the other side. The three of them hugged in the doorway for a moment before Renaud stepped back and ushered her through. Joan pulled a three-legged stool closer to the low fire and rested her feet on the hearth, warming them and drying the mud that caked the soles. Now I wish to go to Avignon. Jacques and Gaston are for there to join the king, she explained. And what will you do? You are a woman. You cannot fight. I do not want to fight. I want to stop Gaston and Jacques, bring them home. He lifted the sword she had leaned next to the hearth and pulled the blade from the sheath to examine it. So you stole your father's sword to force them back? I could if I wished. Imagine me carrying those two and tied and bound. Whose backside would father beat first? He settled the sword back into the corner and tisked. This is no joking matter. I am not laughing. I will do what I must. Will you take me? Michelle bustled around the table and refilled water into a glass and passed it to Joan. I do not know, said Renaud. It is not safe for me to travel alone. It is not safe for me to travel either. What good would I be against bandits? I am only a farmer. It's your presence that I require, not your sword. I can handle anything that comes along. He took the glass from her hand and quaffed the cold water. Little maid, if I only had your confidence. I was inspired by the father I traveled with. He told me of a vision he thinks I had. Renaud dropped the glass. The clay cup shattered on the hard-packed floor of the hut and Michelle rushed over to shove Renaud out of the way and pick up the pieces. He plopped into a chair next to Joan and stared at her with his mouth open. You had a vision? Michelle stopped cleaning and stared up at Joan from the floor. A dream, really? Did you see God? Michelle asked with wonder in her voice. No, but I heard him. What did he say? He told me to fight. God told you to fight and you are going to Avignon. Do you know what this means? That I'm to fight to bring Jacques and Gaston home? Joan ventured. Her cousin scoffed. No, the king is in Avignon. God is steering you to the king. I think not. His wife tossed the pieces of the clay into the fire and brushed off her hands. She stood next to Joan and put a hand on her shoulder. What other reason would he tell you to fight? To bring my future husband home. Renaud waved off her suggestion. Nonsense. You have been touched by God. Now who is talking nonsense? I am just Joan. Michel studied her for a moment. Her hair was still tucked down the back of her shirt, a man's shirt that belonged to her brother and hid the fact that she was a woman. Her soft face was feminine, but gritty under the dirt, and only those who were looking for a girl would see one without deeper scrutiny. Joan looked like half the boys in the village who had gone off to fight at the behest of the king. Yet here she was, traveled half the distance alone and playing humble at conversing with God. A girl who has been trained by her father to be a great swordsman, said Michel. A girl smarter than most people I know. A girl God spoke to. Joan shifted in the chair and thought about running for the road. True, it would not be safe to make the trip alone, and if she ran into trouble in the form of English soldiers that roamed the countryside, she wasn't as confident as she said when it came to beating them in a fight. But the look in the eyes of her cousin and his wife gave her pause. She had seen that look in the church at Mass as people gazed upon the statue of Christ on the cross, or at the box that contained a bone of the Apostle Paul. Now they were looking at her in the same manner, and Joan did not like it. She needed to get out of there, but she needed her cousin to go with her because the fact that a man was with her would deter many who would do a girl alone harm. Will you go with me to Avignon? Let me get the priest, Renaud gushed. No. Why? He should know of this. No. This is between you and me. Joan didn't want the village priest to come and question her. She wasn't sure how she might answer or how her answers might be taken, though there was truth enough in them. There is nothing to be ashamed of. You have been chosen, explained Michel. I am not ashamed. Then let us tell, Renaud encouraged her. No, not until we reach Avignon. If you will go with me. He still looked at her with glowing eyes and bowed his head. His wife walked over to him and put a hand on the back of his neck and bowed her head with him. I will go. The adventure continues. Keep reading in the Maid.